It's time for fun, learning, commentary, laughs, and more care of the most diverse group in the genealogy and family history world. Welcome to BlackProGen Live with your hosts, Nika and True. And it's time for fun, learning, commentary, laughs, and more. Alex, Ellen, Tony, Shelly, Teresa, Bernice, Felicia, Willie, Renata, and Tasia. It's BlackProGen Live, genealogy, family history research with flavor. People of color have often lived in communities where they were drastically in the minority. For episode 99, we'll cover the ways you can unearth the story of your ancestors when it seems as though they were the only folks like them living in their community. Thanks so much for joining us for BlackProGen Live's episode 99, Black People Live Here Too, researching people of color families in isolation. Have a question or comment? Feel free to join the conversation now. Participate in the live chat taking place on YouTube to the top right of the screen if you're watching on a computer, and at the bottom of the YouTube app on your mobile device. Also, feel free to weigh in on Twitter by tweeting us at BlackProGen or use the hashtag BlackProGen. Of course, we are on social media when the show is not happening, sharing articles, news, tips, tricks, and all sorts of things. So feel free to like us on Facebook and be sure to follow us on Twitter. Also, if you've ever missed a live episode and you don't quite understand why, be sure to set your reminders. All you need to do is head to my YouTube channel and click subscribe, or you can set reminders under the episodes that you're interested in the upcoming live streams area of the page. And then that way, each time we go live or whenever I post new content, you will be alerted when that happens. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get our panel on for the evening. We've got an illustrious group with us tonight, including our favorite person with the Y chromosome. Let's start off with James. How are you, Mr. Morgan?
Well, right now it's pretty darn cold out here in the DMV area. Not as cold as some places, but not as warm as we like it. But I'm happy to be here back on BlackProGen. It's November the 12th, and I'm just very thankful to see all of my family and friends here once again.
All right, all right. Moving down the coast a little bit, we're going to go to Charleston, because I know that's where she is, because she's got the blinds. Tony Carey.
Hi, friends. Tony Carrier from the Center for Family History at the International African American Museum. From what feels like a cold Charleston tonight, it's in the mid-40s now and going down below 30.
Yeah, it is 19 degrees here in Memphis. So yes, Burr, it's cold in here. There must be some Toros in the atmosphere. All right, moving forward down the coast to what should be sunny Florida, but it's not. Ellen Fernandez-Sacco.
Hey everybody, Ellen Fernandez-Sacco here from Tampa. It's been raining today and it hasn't really quite dropped the extreme drops that you guys are experiencing, but we'll see what happens. Hopefully I won't have to drag all these plants inside tonight, but who knows?
Yeah, you guys should see my basil plant. It died a slow death and it's still out there dying. It's like this because I didn't bring it in. So I'm missing my basil right about now. Although you guys, I'll have you know that my cherry tomatoes are still producing right now.
Wow. Wow.
I haven't gone to get them. My father-in-law has been rummaging through my last bits of my garden in the backyard. So I didn't even know they were there until he told me. So anywho, moving up the coast, we're going to go to the Boogie Down Bronx, our girl, Teresa Vega.
Teresa Vega, Radiant Roots, Boricua Branches, and actually uptown near the Boogie Down, New York City. And yeah, tippity top of Manhattan.
Yes.
And it's only 34 degrees. I'm not going to complain seeing that it's 19 where you are.
It's 19 where I'm at. True weather check-in. Have you froze? Did your car doors freeze shut this morning like ours did?
Well, it's your girl, True Lewis from My True Roots, and it is 16 degrees here at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and
Oh,
I am freezing. I got both of my heaters on, and my car was okay because it's inside the garage because I'm lazy like that.
See, we got a carport. We got a carport.
Girl, I
And
had
so
to get that 2-car one.
look,
I
look, next
refuse.
purchase, that's on the list. It's on the thing. Look, that's on the list. Cause look, that carport, yeah. But it was so funny. My truck, my Jeep, y'all know, if you got a paid off car, I'd say amen, because I got a paid off car. And my Jeep, let me tell you how broke down my Jeep is, y'all. There's a hatch. It's a Jeep Cherokee, right? The hatch, you know how you're supposed to pull it up and it stays?
Yeah.
Mine broke a long time ago. So if you put groceries in my car, you got to have the hatch on your head.
Oh,
So
Lord,
you
I'm
can keep it
dying.
open. And then you put them in. So Rashad decided to drive my car this morning, and the doors were frozen shut. And so he's pouring water on the side to like try and get it. No, would not. So he didn't think I saw this, but I did. He had to climb through the hatch of the car. Remember, I just told you that the hatch does this, right? It doesn't
With
stay
his
out.
own long legs.
My husband is 6'4", so of course, naturally, I'm watching from the house and I'm dying laughing. Being true ain't right because we over here dying laughing.
I know, but when you in my car, I put the heat or the air on your booty.
Tell Rashad I feel for him.
I know.
Oh my gosh. So
y'all heartless.
So he had to
to
climb through the back to get to the front, and then to open the doors because he could get it from the outside a little bit, but he had to like push it from the outside. So yeah, that's how cold it was.
Girl, I bet he was all hunching up trying to juke that thing.
Please tell me he was just trying to go to work and not to get a Popeye's chicken sandwich.
He was just trying to go to work.
Okay.
He was just trying to go to work. He sure was. Oh my gosh. Well, chat room, thank you all so much for joining us. My cousin Raymond Reeves says, so next week is your syndication 100th episode. Absolutely. Yes, it is. It will be the 100th episode and not a fake 100. We're not starting at episode 100. We started at episode 1. So yes, it will be the 100th episode of BlackProGen Live next week. Of course, we're going to be talking about the festivities later on in the show. So feel free to check that out. But we want to make sure we say hello to everyone. Dale E. Colston, what is going on? Panelist Bernice Bennett, Renata Yarborough Sanders. Hello, you're in the house. Hello, Harpista, 1979. What's going on? Casey May, Sierra Cotton Keller, what's going on? Another panelist. Shelley Viola Murphy is in the house, along with Maggie faculty, Janice Lovelace. We've got a lot of people who are joining us live. 8043 Gullah News. Hey, what's going on? How are you? Christine Varner. Our mammies, thank you for making it. We're glad that you did. So tonight's episode, I just have to say personally, I think I benefit from my folks not living in isolation. So it was a little bit of a challenge for me because I'm like, what do you mean the whole enumeration district is Black? Which is, but that's an advantage, right? If you don't have family where you literally can go through almost the entire enumeration district, or at least 3 or 4 pages in front or behind, and you don't see any W's on the page or any other designations, right? We pick on the fact that segregation existed, but we have to admit that it is a benefit to us in our genealogy research. Yeah, it is, guys. Like, as much as you probably don't want to admit that, it's true. So when we're talking about families in isolation, we have to define what that is, right? How do you know if your family lived in isolation? For me, I just identify what I consider one of the hallmarks, right? It's this one Black family in like the whole county or parish or the whole town, or maybe there's only 3 or 4 families. How do we identify if our family is a family that is living in isolation from other people of color or populations of folks?
What I would say, one of the ways you can do that is by finding out what is it that maybe made them unique as far as their movements go. Perhaps they were in the military, which would definitely scatter people all up to places far and wide that you would not think of, whether it be military or foreign service. Also, and this is something that really kind of inspired me as far as the idea for this show topic goes, is religion. I think a lot of people don't think about how far people will go for religious beliefs. And whereas, yes, many people, of the same cultural heritage will be of similar religious background, you always have those one or two people who go off and join something that may be a little unorthodox for the majority of that group. So that's another thing that you might want to bear in mind as well. If there's a unique religious experience, as well as that the family shares, that may lead to a group of people ending up in a place where you wouldn't really expect to find people of color, but they're there.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the larger conversation, right? Because a lot of these movements, in terms of bringing people to places where they weren't, were rooted in religion, right? Like,
Right.
and the fact that religion and exploration a lot of times were tied together. So if you have a family that you're looking at, you maybe somebody fell off the face of the earth, right? All the other family members seem to live there. Maybe you need to open your mind to, well, maybe, wait a minute, here's this group of people living in Omaha, Nebraska, and they're Black, but they have like Louisiana or Arkansas birthplaces, right? So, so you can't necessarily rule out that those are your folks. Teresa, what were you going to add?
I was going to say, you have to look at the history of slavery. So a lot of my ancestors were in the North, and just based on population statistics at different time periods, at one point, New York was right behind Charleston in the number of enslaved people. However, a lot of times it was a lot less. So in that respect, you have to look at, how these folks first arrived. And they might not have all been in the South. They might have always been in the North, like my folks. And then when you see the census records, like when I wrote Hang Route, for instance, there were only in the first census 80 Black people out of over 3,000. At the height, Hang Route had probably 200 people by the end of the 1800s. So, and you're not talking a lot of people. Those are, when I think of Newark, 1800, 300 Black people, not 300 families, 300 Black people, when the average family was anywhere from like 8 to 12. So we have to look at just the geography and when people arrived as well. And then back that up with, of course, census records, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
Anyone else care to follow up? How do you know if your family lives in isolation, right? What are some of the classic hallmarks that one can use to identify this? Like we talked about this, the census pages where it's, no other people of color, but we talked about religion, right? Religious movements, looking into, maybe early Methodism, AME churches, CME churches, whatever popped up in this area. Another thing is vocation, right? Or occupation, driving where, people are going to locations, right? Typically we think of Oakland and we'll think of Pullman porters, right? The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right? Huge location for that, right? Like that's obvious. But then later on, we don't think about Long Beach for people who are in the military, right? Or San Diego for someone who's in the Navy, right? Long Beach now is associated with Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre. But back in the day, exactly, you already know. But back in the day, that was not the case. There weren't a lot of Black folks living in those environments. So occupation is another. What are some additional hallmarks? Mining, right? That's another.
The whaling industry in the 16, 17, 1800s. I'm thinking of New York, Rhode Island, New Bedford, Boston, up and down, and you had sailors.
Also, and this is going further back, but even when you think about trapping, as well, we don't think about today how important hunting and trapping and furs and whatnot really were, earlier in earlier times. But that's another way people got out. I mean, and if you don't believe me, you ever heard of a place called Chicago?
Detroit.
Detroit, exactly. So that's another aspect.
Clearly there had to be a reason why someone was going there because of all that stinking snow.
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly. And the thing about it is, and I'm sure we had to have touched on Illinois history at some point in one of these past 98 episodes. And if we didn't, you better go back and check, make sure, right? But a lot of people don't realize that Chicago was founded by a Black guy. who would have thought you got a man of African descent
Los Angeles too.
in Illinois? Yeah, see, so yeah.
There's a lot of
Any other
displacement.
hallmarks? Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
just thinking your typical port cities that attracted folks. I'm thinking along the East Coast, whether it's Charleston, DC, Baltimore, all up and down the East Coast, as well as when you think of Chicago, the Great Lakes area as well.
Tony, anything you want to add?
I think about the people who were freedom seekers who went down to Florida
Mm-hmm.
to find freedom down there. Yeah. It depends on if the migration was voluntary or involuntary.
Yeah, and that's another touch point we have to talk about at this point, right? Because some of this stuff is like, we're thinking, early 20th century, right? A lot of this stuff we're thinking, right? And you can even go further. Think about the last episode we just had, you all. We had someone on who was, his uncle and family were put to this horrible experience. And of course, that then made the family disperse into different places, right? Which could have put them in isolation. And so while it may not necessarily be lynching, I know for a fact, my cousin Jean that we had on the show, her father was ousted from work as a longshoreman in New Orleans because of their involvement in the civil rights movement, and was forced to move with family members to Denver.
Right.
And was living in Denver when they were going on their rides, you guys. He wasn't even at home because he had no way of providing for his family. So there is a possibility that if they were just so scared, that the whole family could have been uprooted and taken to Denver, but that didn't happen. Well, what did happen? Yet another family member, same set of folks. Jean's brother couldn't get work because of what they did. And he had a family. So they went to New Hampshire.
Right.
And his children were born in New Hampshire. So this we're not even talking 19th century.
Right.
We're talking 20th century with this. This is the 60s. And so there's even a whole movement. I've blogged about this. I don't think enough people know about it, but the White Citizens Council in New Orleans began this process, or this program called the Reverse Freedom Rides, where people in the South who were a part of the White Citizens Council would collect money and send Black people from the South up to white cities in the North as a way of reversing the tide of racism or of integration. Because they said if these folks were coming down from the North, being outside agitators and trying to integrate their spaces, that they had a right to do the same thing. And so what happened is that a lot of these folks were sent to locations, of course, right? They're in the minority. They were promised jobs, housing, all this stuff. And a lot of times it didn't materialize. So homework for tonight's episode is to research the reverse freedom rides. Go into newspapers.com, go into Genealogy Bank, and just type it in. In fact, if you probably Google it, you'll find the blog post that I wrote, because nobody knows about this program. And these people, oh my gosh, you guys, like, just imagine, right? Here you are thinking new life, right? This is Atlanta. That's how Atlanta was when I was in college and right after, right? That was like the Mecca. Everybody's trying to move to Atlanta. And then you get there.
Freaknik.
Yeah, I think that drove a lot of that though. But Atlanta was more, more diverse city, but still look into that. So moving forward, we talked about motivations. We talked about religion. We talked about jobs like coal mining. We talked about the military, exploration, right? Like you're going out, the other thing I think we have to consider there are already small pockets of populations, right? Like the person that goes out, goes and sets up shop, and then the rest of the family goes and meets them. But all of that typically is motivated by other things. What other motivations do you guys think were part of these migrations of folks to
piggyback on what Tony said, also the idea of like maroon communities, freedom, communities of people of runaway, enslaved persons or formerly enslaved persons who self-liberate and then form their own communities that may or may not have ever been on a map. And a lot of times when you hear the word maroon, people think about the Caribbean and South America, but then you have to remember that there was communities of Black people living in the Great Dismal Swamp.
Right.
And elsewhere.
And a lot of times we don't talk about that, but those people had history and their genetics may have influenced yours. We need to know about that.
Another thing, go ahead.
The Black Seminoles that were left Florida, and they went to Great Andros Island in the Bahamas. So it's not even going to an adjacent state or something. You're actually crossing a body of water to kind of reestablish and survive with your community.
Absolutely.
You think
So-
about at the end of the Civil War, well, actually more at the beginning of the Civil War, the slaveholders were actually moving from the South to Texas
Mhm.
and taking enslaved people with them.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And
You could
in
have been going to something, you could have been running away from something.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm thinking about in New Jersey, you had free blacks forming their own towns.
Mhm.
I'm thinking Timbuktu. I'm thinking a lot of other communities. There's a great book called Parallel Communities that look at across New Jersey, all these black settlements. And folks were moving to places so that they could live free and have community protection.
Mhm.
And the same thing out west too. You had Black Towns of Oklahoma as
Mhm.
well. I actually just read something where I believe that there's talk of a TV series coming about Boley, Oklahoma in the near future, possibly. You think about people like Pap Singleton going out to Nebraska and places like that, setting up different towns in Nebraska and Kansas for Black people, and basically in the middle of nowhere, you know. And those histories need to be told as well, because I think we talked a few episodes about the Watchmen episode where they show Tulsa and whatnot. Well, Tulsa, or the Black Wall Street section, that's one aspect of the Black experience in the West. But we also have to remember, to go along with what was said earlier, that there was an exploratory aspect as well of people saying, hey, we're not getting treated well in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, and Mississippi. Let's go somewhere else and set up shop for ourselves. So we definitely want to uplift the name of like people like Pap Singleton in his establishment in Nicodemus, Kansas, for sure.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, you talk about acts, right? Like the
Mhm.
Homestead Act, where land opens up, right? Or some, it's like, oh, we've got this new condo complex coming out, buy
Right.
a condo here. You know what I mean? It's the equivalent of what, of what people had then. It makes you think of the Exodusters,
Right.
folks who, there's a branch of my family is doing a reunion, and they're like asking me for research, and one of their ancestors was part of the Exodusters, where Isaiah Montgomery actually wrote a letter to the governor of Kansas asking for assistance to get these people back to Mississippi, because they got to Kansas and things did not go as planned. A lot of folks died. You know what I mean? So I imagine some of those folks stayed, but that branch of my family ended up coming back to Mississippi. But that still doesn't mean that it wasn't an important location to search out records for, right? Because we're trying to fill in all the gaps, right? If they come back or if they don't, if they stay or if they don't. So yeah, I think it's a great thing. So what was life like in these communities, you all? What were these people experiencing? Because I mean, we already know what it feels like now to be the only person that looks like you in the room, but that's being that now. What was it like then? What are some of the accounts you guys have heard or things that you've come across that talk about that?
Well, I know through my family history, there is a lot of early African-American endogamy.
Mhm.
There was a lot of interracial relationships, not only non-consensual, but consensual, like my fourth great grandparents right after the Revolutionary War, because there's so few people in these communities in general, especially in the small rural areas, that people got together, whoever. So way before Loving versus Loving, you have these pockets in the Northeast where people were mixing and matching. You also have African-American communities merging with indigenous populations. And then you have communities that are well known by the dominant population, which makes them a little bit vulnerable when times change. And I keep thinking about the Franklin Park tragedy, where in the North, this couple of guys are killed for, either history says that they killed a white woman, a pregnant white woman and her daughter, and then the town becomes a sundown town. I'm thinking about my ancestors who were sold south out of the Van Wickle illegal slave ring in 1818. And I wrote a blog post, The Insidiousness of Slavery, because these were known people. So the folks knew everybody in the community knew who to target, who owned who. and they were known because there weren't a lot of people. In some of these communities, you're talking about maybe 40 families,
Mhm.
and everybody's interrelated, because who are you going to marry but other people of color in the same community? So while everybody's celebrating Mayflower descendants and Jamestown, Teresa A. Vega is celebrating the Lions, Greens, Merritts, the the Greens, Thompson Kings, because there's just this intermarriage of people going back generations and generations. But if you don't know the history 300 years ago or 200 years ago, even today, people lose that because these communities end up disappearing.
Well, that brings up more of a larger point though, because some of this was insulation, right? Where you're talking about people in isolation, right? Like if your family has worked for, 20 years to become free, you're not typically going to want to marry somebody who's enslaved, right? Like, you know what I mean? This is a way of protecting sort of like your way of life and what you're used to. So I would imagine like, that's a big reason why there was a level of endogamy, was because that was a level of protection that folks could have, just as much as they possibly could in that, given the circumstances, what was going on at the time. Some of the things that people are bringing up in the chat room, which are very, well warranted, talking about people being forced out, of course, by force, right? That's something we talked about at length this season, especially with regard to lynchings, right? And not just necessarily the victims of the lynching and their families, but the community as a whole, right? Complexion of it completely changes because of an act of violence against one family. And everybody's like, how we have that joke that if you see one Black person running, everybody else takes off and we don't even care what it is. We're going because we're not going to stay. That literally is I think that's a very important point
and forced
to make.
migration, when I think of Trail of Tears,
which that's forced migration with forced migration within the forced migration.
Yeah.
Right. One thing I would add to the question at hand is I think that people also saw benefits to being some of the first Black people to travel somewhere. I mean, there are some places where you're going where they don't yet have laws in the books to say you can or can't do something, and people were able to find opportunities in that way. I'm actually posting a link in the chat about George Washington. Not that George Washington. There's another George Washington who was a pioneer in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, of the city of, I think it's Centralia, originally called Central City. And I read up on him earlier this week. I really thought it was a fascinating story about how he and his wife basically went out to Washington. They traveled out to Washington State. He was actually adopted by a white family, and he basically spent many of his formative years basically trying to find somewhere where he could just be and exist as a free Black person. And when he decides to buy some land in Washington State, he ends up, getting an opportunity because it's not even a state yet; it's a territory, right? And so he uses that as a means of capitalizing, becoming somewhat wealthy, and being able to form this city, which still exists. So I posted that link in the chat so you all can read more about it on your own time.
Anything else you guys have to add regarding, because I think that you brought up an important point, right? Some of these people were pioneers, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we also have to think about people of color communities in isolation where it literally is just a Black town,
right?
Like all these little I talked about Isaiah Montgomery, right? And the fact that he was owned by Jefferson Davis, and Mount Bayou, right? The fact that in addition to being isolated within a white city, and it's just you could also isolate yourself out as well, right? And in some ways that could provide benefits as well. So what were these sort of like, with these pockets of people of color, were these sort of like cities within a city? Like, how do they operate?
They can be, I think, but sometimes there wasn't enough administrative functions. Like people weren't necessarily able to participate in that. But then later, the adjacent town would see that as a reason to, to end it, to kind of end the town through redistricting or rebuilding, like what happened with Cangrejos in Puerto Rico. It was this center. A lot of people lived there. And at a certain point, it never really got an administrative center to it. So then when Santurce was expanding, they just ran roads and just broke up the whole thing. And that was in the 1860s.
Sometimes I would say they were neighborhoods within small towns
Yeah, there's that too.
that
Mhm.
ultimately end up disappearing when population changes for whatever reasons.
Mhm.
And I saw that with my folks where you talk about migration, white ethnic immigrants came in and displaced, took the jobs and displaced, and my folks ended up coming down to the city in Westchester, New York. So
But
Just like,
then
yeah.
you can't overlook the fact that these black towns did exist and were fully functioning municipalities as well.
Right.
You know, for example, I'm thinking of Eatonville, Florida, which is most famous probably for being
Zora.
the hometown of Zora Neale
Mm.
Hurston, right? And you know, and I think back about how she talked about growing up black police. Her father was the mayor for like I think what 3 terms. You know,
Mhm.
so that's a function in and of itself. And I'm wondering
Right.
now who among us is doing the work today of digging through just the records of Eatonville, Florida. You know, as famous as
There's
Zora
a
Neale
whole book
Hurston
on
is.
that.
Yeah, there is. Okay, good.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe I need to get it. You know, maybe I'm
Yeah.
behind. But you know, to learn not just about her as a writer and her upbringing, but also, you know, what did her father do as the mayor? There's a whole lot of records that I imagine were generated just in his term alone, right? That
Mhm.
might be able to help other people in their own genealogical journey. So we need to bear those things in mind as well.
Anything else you guys do so when you're researching in these places, right? Obviously the crew type of research is paramount, right? Where you're researching, the church, recreation, environmental and work connections that people have. How what are some of the resources that you could use to tell the ancestral story when you're looking at things from that perspective?
Definitely church records.
The census. I know I use that a lot for my town of Midway in Alabama, like as far back as it goes, and how they started out as a close-knit community. They started out with maybe like over 100,000 people. And if you look at it versus then compared to now, it's like 423 people in the town. And they are isolated. They did keep to themselves. And, I never really can fully get it answered about why did daddy's people stay there and versus why did he leave. I have all these theories, but the ones that did stay down there, they have been successful, and they will let you know we came from a one-room school, but they're doctors and lawyers now. But that census tells me a lot who was able to do what, because a lot of that stuff, maybe 3 or 4 people in Midway would be able to be vouched by a white person to do things, but they were like the representative of the whole Black community there. And just everything that you all touched on. But it just goes back to, for me personally, about how Bullitt County is run and how you see the difference, over the decades from those census, because they do have them online for each year for that little incorporated town. So I really use that as a guideline about who's doing what, the preachers and what elected person they'll let have a seat or be at the sheriff office or whatever else is going on in town. So
Cemetery records.
mhm.
It seemed like when you have a community in isolation, everybody ends up in a particular cemetery. So you can go to those records and see maybe, names you haven't seen before, heard before.
Mhm.
I would also recommend looking at the records of the majority population that you're talking about, particularly things like diaries and journals or even the newspapers, because oftentimes what you'll find is if you're researching people of color, but
Mhm.
you're looking in the records or the history of the majority community, let's just say the white community, um, oftentimes you may find a note in there because people of color are going to stick out more, whether it's a positive note or a negative note. Who it may be something as simple as that one Negro family has bought a house on the outskirts of town. It may be something like that one Negro family has bought up a bunch of acreage. Who the heck do they think they are? And so sometimes it's good to step out of the traditional thought process of doing the cemeteries and whatnot, because we're going to do that type of work, but also look at what other people are saying about them, because a lot of times you'll find out that those things are noted as well, especially when people are doing something when they get themselves, so to speak.
In addition to church and cemetery records, I would add probate records. I would add school records, yearbooks. The other things is in some of these smaller towns, you're going to have to look at the corresponding towns around them, because people might have lived in one town but worked in the next community over. So look at adjacent communities, especially when it comes to churches and cemeteries as well. In the Northeast, I'm thinking of my family in the tri-state region. Our ancestors are buried in many specific historic African American cemeteries, in addition to your larger integrated cemeteries. So you do want to check out that. And of course, your local history records at historic societies, libraries. It's the same traditional genealogy research that we always talk about. But you need to expand it more to include some of these other smaller towns that are around these isolated communities.
I just want to add one thing, is that there are books on dead towns also that compile villages and towns that don't exist anymore, and that could also be helpful if you're looking in a certain area and you can't seem to turn up a place, so.
Absolutely.
Smut Eye, Alabama, Burnt Corn, Alabama. I could go on and on
Ooh,
about those
you just
little
said burnt
towns
corn.
around
Ooh,
Midway.
gee. The cheesecake, Louisiana. It's like, why did we choose that name?
Real
But
Alabama
you know
people
what?
know about burnt corn, Alabama. Let me tell y'all something.
Look, there are a lot of places with funny names and they don't exist anymore. And I would imagine, True, we'll have to put the link to the mapping episode, right? Because we talked a lot
Yeah.
at that finding locations that no longer exist, or they're just a historical location, and how to find those places. Sometimes you can find those places on Google Maps, but sometimes you have to go to tax records for that particular place, or you've got to go to the Geographical Names Information System from the U.S. Geological Survey. I use that a lot. Because there used to be a school there. There used to be, maybe there's a plantation there, or maybe there's a cemetery there, right? So what are some additional things, right? Because we're trying to reconstruct the ancestral narrative, right? Do the same practices work in locations of isolation as they do in places where people are not, or is it actually easier to research these folks?
It can be. You can use some of those same methods. However, a lot of times what I would find and what I recommend is it may be best to go visit some of these places. Get on the ground, go talk to people. I mean, I can tell you right now, researching my family in Abbeville, Alabama, it's good to call them. It's better to go down there and go down some of them back roads and different things, because I can tell you right now, it's very easy for people. Like, I have family cemeteries that are only on Find a Grave because I got up off from in front of my computer, hopped on a plane, and took the pictures myself and put them there on Find a Grave myself with these two hands, right? And I mean, it's just a fact of life. I mean, when you go to some rural communities, and this is something that a lot of, I think, younger people, especially if you grew up in an urban environment like I did, really don't have a concept of. There are places in this country to this day where you only have in church twice a month. Once a month, or if you do have it every month, it's okay. 1 month we're going to be at the Baptist church, and then next month we're going to the AME church. Next week we're going to the AME church. Then after that we're going to open a CME church. It's the same 10 people having church for the same. You know what I mean? It's one of those type of things. I was just talking to a mentor of mine this weekend, and he was talking about his family in Georgia and how the church that he grew up in was St. John's Baptist Church, and it was almost going downhill, but then they ended up going back up, because the Warren family moved back into town, and the Warrens were some of his other cousins, and they just so happened that they grandmama died and left them some land in the house, so they decided to move back to the neighborhood, and so now the church is back doing good again. And all because so sometimes you have to go to see those places. I promise you, that one little church, you're not gonna find it on some of these main websites and things. It's not gonna happen. But when you go down there, you're gonna meet an old cousin or somebody who know everything you need to know. I'm sorry.
Well, that's
Teresa.
true. And they share pastors, and the pastors have to go from, that's the reason why they only have church twice a month and every,
Right.
or maybe once a month with the pastor, but every other Sunday is Sunday school
Right.
until the pastor makes his way.
Right. But if you
It's
can
still very, it's
right,
still very like,
but if you can
go
get
ahead,
brother
Jeff.
Jimmy Lee on the phone, Jimmy Lee knows what's going on.
He
He
does,
knows.
but that's the thing. But that's if he answers your call, because you know how boomers are about the caller ID and numbers they don't recognize. They won't pick
Mhm.
it up now.
That's right.
So yeah, I think you're right, because in some ways it's so funny, that old system that people are still doing in a lot of like really rural areas. It's mimicking the fact that yes, it literally would take him a whole month to get around to you because he was riding on a horse. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It completely like
Yep.
removes the fact that you have
I had a
two
cousin.
words
I had a
in your
cousin.
head.
That's right. I had a cousin named Willie Weems, and his whole thing was, if you want to see cousin Willie, you better meet him at lunchtime at Hardee's. And literally, and I had other cousins who told me straight up, if you really want to talk to him, you better catch him at Hardee's. And when I went to Hardee's, this man held court at a fast food restaurant. I seen white folks and black folks going to him for advice, all type of things. And when I went, it was like a line. It literally was a line to meet with this man. I had photographs, right? I finally go up to him. I said, "Hey, I'm your cousin James." I had explained to him who I was, and I'm doing genealogy research and stuff. He goes, "Oh, I know who you are. I know your grandmama and this one." And then he just started talking, and guess what I did? He knew everything. If anybody knows about my Weems family research that I've done over the years, he was able to fill in so many gaps for me. We got in the car. He drove me by the house where Rosa Parks' grandfather lived, and no, that's not where she lived. Her father's house is over here. Everything.
Nika,
It's stuff he
Some
told
of
me
these,
now that I'm taking to the Library of Congress in a couple weeks because of stuff he
well,
told me at Hardee's.
Well, but see, that goes back to a larger point, though, because if we're talking about families that are in isolation, right? Some of these people who are the griots of these communities are no longer living there, right? Because industry has left, families have moved, right? Like just how you have the Great Migration to northern cities and things like that, you have migration out of these, these communities, because we have to, let's talk a bit about how hard it was to be in those places, though, right? Like where your network is, what if you didn't get along with all the other Black folks there because of cultural differences, not or maybe even class stuff, right? So what were your options? Like you were just around your family, you know what I mean? And then it makes me think of Julia or Fraser Baker that we did on the lynching episode, where his wife and his children left South Carolina and moved to Boston, and their whole experience where everything was supposed to be better. We're in the North. We're not dealing with racism, right? And then the woman's children, she outlives all of her kids because they die from like tuberculosis, and ends up having to move back South, right? And one of the things that I really liked to hear was her perspective on what life was like for them there, and how her tenor sort of didn't change from what she was experiencing in the South, right? So I think that's part of us cataloging the experience, right? And cataloging the narratives of these locations and these experiences is, what was it like in Salt Lake? What was it like in Denver? What are some of the things that you guys have heard about this type of stuff?
Nika, let me add here two things, getting back. One of the things when we're looking at populations in isolation is we have to consider how borders change. And so you need to go back to historical maps, as you mentioned, because some towns maybe no longer exist because they were incorporated later on into what Ellen was saying, into a different territory. The other thing is a lot of your local historical societies have oral history projects, which I know in Greenwich, they've interviewed several people of color going way back, elderly people. So you might want to look to your local history resources to see if there were oral history. Newspapers, I'm thinking just this week alone, my cousin Andrea sent me a whole newspaper article from, I believe it was Paterson, New Jersey, where in 1864, where they were naming all of these people who were members of the Black community. She's like, Teresa, keep this for your records. I don't know if any of these are our folks, but if anyone you know is researching Paterson, New Jersey, here were the people here in the early to mid 1800s, and they were talking about the churches, not only churches, but Masonic lodges, mutual aid societies, all this stuff. So again, if you go back to historic newspapers, you might be able to resurrect information on some of these isolated communities that may or may not exist.
Well, we've got, of course, an episode on newspapers. We did that earlier this year. So if you're interested in trying to dig into some of that information, definitely check out that episode. And something else is kind of coming up in the chat room that I think definitely warrants conversation is the fact that some of these people of color communities, they were isolations within themselves based on skin complexion, right? Like if you weren't lighter on the lighter end of the spectrum, right? Or if you didn't come from folks that had, were several generations free, right? And in some ways we talk about class too, because that was a class issue. Oh, that's a whole other show. We ain't even talked about that, right? How people coming from free people of color families was a class, not as in, upper middle class, how we talk about it, but in terms of skin complexion and being able to pass for white or be able to move in a white world, kind of undetected, or being able to get favor for certain things based on your complexion and your connections that came with that complexion, right? And so some of these experiences that we're talking about for lighter skin families are drastically different than they were for darker skin families, and may be a reason why those darker skin families never stayed in those locations or shifted around or moved elsewhere. And we talked about jobs as well, right? The railroad, we didn't even mention that, right? That could have sent people to different locations, and all the system with that, right? Especially when you're talking about people during the Civil War, during Reconstruction, who were building the Transcontinental Railroad, and how, one railroad company was largely Asian or Chinese, and then the other was 99% white. And so, so you've got towns that spring up along the routes, right? With large people of color populations, and so there's that aspect as well. There's a plea from Dante Eubanks in the chat room that we need to talk about colorism, and the class system associated with colorism within people of color communities, because that's not just an issue that's isolated to Black folks.
The Black elite have a part in all of this.
We know.
Yeah. I just thought I'd drop that.
Yeah, that's an interesting dichotomy, because the way I see that actualizing itself in the genealogy world are certain genealogy societies in certain parts of the country that look like the shape of a boot and sit on the Mississippi River. I didn't say the city. I just said a city. Where if your folks weren't free and didn't come from that stock, you kind of get a little bit of a, they look at you a little different. And it's also interesting when you start looking at the progression of civil rights stuff, because those families that were set upon that stage, they weren't part of the movement. It was the transplants who expected more when they got there and they didn't get it. So people, there's a lot
that we haven't,
that are talking about that. So that's definitely something we should consider. So how can the narratives about these communities be preserved? Teresa kind of touched on, going to local historical societies, things like that. But I mean, we got to be real, you guys. We got to be practical. There may not be a historical society that is in that area, and even if there is one, they may not care about this little small community of Black folks, right? I mean, think about it. We have so many county and parish histories that we all have just because it's nice to have, because our families from that area that act like Black folks just landed on a plane, came off a spaceship from Mars. Right.
This is why we need to be documenting. When I do my research, the whole point of me resurrected in the community of Hangroot was because I went to the historic society and they didn't have anything. So it took me going through every census record from the first census record up until at least the early 1900s to write all these family names. And I went back to the first census where my fourth great grandfather was Anthony Negro. Okay, that Green wasn't even called Green until the 1810 census. So, you know, when we're doing research and we're seeing who's living next to who, and they are folks in these isolated communities, then we should be just gathering records and doing and saying, oh, our ancestors lived next to so-and-so, so-and-so, and these are the same people. You go to the church records and you see the same people in the churches. Well, now I know, you know, the Kings were married to the Thompsons and they lived right next to store to the Conovers and blah, blah, blah. And you're resurrecting these communities. And it's so important because when we consider not only our cemeteries that are under attack and being erased, you know, it's up to us to be the voice of our ancestors and be the voice of our ancestors' neighbors and be the voice of our ancestral communities to start documenting their neighbors back and writing our history back into the record, put it out there.
Yeah. I have the one, I like to call them my floaters in my tree and on my family tree maker. Cause like I have, you know, a lot of Europeans on my Patriot line. So I found like there was this one Black family, Hercules, that was around them in 1812 and whatnot. And I was curious about him. He's not related to me, but he felt like family. Like what was his interaction with all those white people there? Because, you know, this is a town where intermarriage and all that was going on. But you're right about the documentation and the oral history. You know, I went through that whole spill where I was just in a panic mode, and I started my blog and I went and did the documentary, got permission from the courthouse, and just went down there and just dove into whatever they had at the library and at the archives. And I keep this up now. And I'm just thinking, looking back on it, what if I'm not doing this for my 4 lines, just on my paternal side? Like that scared me. Like out of fear, I did all that work in that short amount of time from 2012 until now. I think I just celebrated my like 7th anniversary on my blog. Because, you know, and you're right, you have to put it on different platforms, different devices, keep that up. We've talked about this numerous of times on so many episodes about that, about keeping up with the history. So
well, and I think you guys are raising an important point, though. It doesn't, like, I think we have to move out of this very selfish space that researchers are in. I constantly talk about this, right? Like, you know, when we did the episode this year, we could have easily focused on just people who were just in our home states.
right.
But that doesn't help us as a community. That's very limiting in like what that does. And so I think, you know, for those of you who are watching, consider free people of color who are living in an environment that is largely enslaved folks. Consider them in an isolated community, right?
Right.
Because it's not like they could, you know, easily interact with enslaved people, right? Like I'm thinking about this Wiley family where my ancestors are from in North Louisiana, and how, you know, when I was, you know, still on the Atlases, came from Cameroon on a spaceship, you know, thinking that there's, you know, there's no way I was going to find the slaveholders. So they just came from Africa on a spaceship. When I was back in that phase, you know, my first question was, well, maybe if I'm looking for them enslaved, I shouldn't be, because maybe they're free. So then I started looking at the free people who were in their environment, and it was literally only one family, and it was like 10 people. And it was consistent, right? Like every census I was seeing that. So then I had questions like, who was their slaveholder? How did they become free, right? And maybe those of us who have the skills to do this and to search this out, maybe it's a matter of, when we do see these families, just poke around and see what's out there on them. You know what I mean? And maybe use some of the old memes, like post on one of the old ancestry message boards, just to put it out there to make sure that it's preserved. Or, you know, maybe it's, you know, you start a blog, or, you know, a free blogger blog that's all about families in isolation, or free people of color families in the Deep South, right? Like that's a whole outside of the major metro areas.
Oh yeah. I'm not
That's
going
a
to forget about you, Hercules, because I don't know how you dealt with all them folks, but you was there
you
and I
know.
saw you, and you're in my tree, even though. But I'll keep on. I
Yeah, and
I, I feel you on that.
yeah, I don't even have, I mean, and I would say even another aspect of this too are people are talking about US color troops. Look at
Mhm.
regiments where people relocated in mass, right?
Mhm.
Like easy study to do would be look at the 1890 veteran census for a particular ancestral location and see all the folks that were in, you know, enumerated in that county or that parish, and look at where they were from, you know, where they were from, right? Maybe they moved somewhere else, but they all went in mass. I think we forget that people did not get mustered out usually in the same location that they got mustered in. So that they could have chosen just to stay. I know one of my big breakthroughs for me came through a pension file, and it's my third great grandmother's brother-in-law was born in Sharrah. I think that's how you say it, South Carolina.
South Carolina, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And he was a part of this regiment, and his regiment got mustered out near Lake Providence. And that's how he ended up there.
And it
So,
still continues on today, even from that era, because our military, we're in a controlled environment. We are in isolated communities in a sense, because we're not, yeah, we have to deal with civilian law, but we got another law we got to adhere to is our military law comes first, besides what we call y'all civilians. And we go from post to post, and we do this like every 3 years. So you've seen the gradual progression of it from then up until now. And we're still like that. Me and my husband are retired, but we want to be around our own. This is where we feel safe at. I mean, yeah, we can go out into the civilian world, go and live anywhere because we're used to doing that, but we just prefer to be around. So you see this, like this is 2019 and they were doing that back then. So,
Mhm.
you know, you're right.
something Angela brings up in the chat room that I think is good too, and she was the one that kind of tipped me up to this as well, is using draft registrations
Mm.
to kind of kind of plot where, maybe mass migrations took place. World War II, World
They
War
were
One.
so
Look at the
badass.
birth locations.
Mhm.
Where the folks were, the draftees, and versus where they're living. That may help you to determine some stuff. We talked about the newspapers, Negro news sections.
So,
I just go ahead, James.
something else that I think that we're leaving out is learning some of the mechanics of some of the trades and vocations that people had. I'm thinking specifically about barbers, and some of those type of hands-on trades, because today people don't really understand that there was a time where if you were a barber, that's a network in and of itself, right? That's almost a secret society in and of itself back in the 1800s. Because what happens is, especially for black men, you're learning the barber trade from a master barber as an apprentice and working your way up to becoming a journeyman barber, which means that now you're able to travel to go meet with other barbers in other cities and other states with a letter of introduction that says, hey, I studied this trade under this master barber for X number of years in Mississippi, right? And there's a really good book that I think I've mentioned before on the show called Knights of the Razor that talks about this, and how there you actually had, believe it or not, as far south as Natchez, Mississippi, free black barbers
Mm.
educating entire classes of young men, sending them to places like St. Louis or Chicago or Detroit, and being able so they could then form their own barbershops, right? So think about the types of trades and things that people were doing, as well as the educational institutions as well. There are many historically black colleges and universities, as well as primary and secondary schools that are set up in places where you just like, what in the world? Why is there a school there? But that school was put there because there were a few people who, we can't go to school with the white students, but we still want to have a school. So also make sure you check out the educational institutions as well.
And to piggyback off of that, when you're going through, Drew mentioned this earlier, census records, I know when I was doing the hang route piece and I kept looking at the records throughout the 1800s, I kept seeing Staunton, Virginia. And so I'm like, why are all these people coming from Staunton, Virginia? And then especially after the Civil War, and a lot of the women were coming up, it was probably word of mouth, but they were coming up to work now that Greenwich was the Rockefellers moved in and things were changing, they were coming up to work as domestics. So if you're going through the census records, just look at where people were born, and then you're like, you'll see it's very informative. And then likewise, I'm going through the records around the same period of time, and I'm seeing massive Irish and Italians coming in to work in the iron works, the factories, textile mills, whatever. So you see that, and then you see our folks moving back into Westchester, going into the city, finding other jobs. But when you look at the records and you see who's coming in and where they're coming from, it's very informative.
So Angela brings up an important question too. She says, are military bases abroad captured in the federal census? And I think she sort of answered her question. She says probably after 1960, because we just weren't everywhere, right? Like we weren't deployed, like we didn't come and just take over. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going into Spain. I'm marking as my area.
Right. I was on mute. I had to laugh at that, but I understand. I get it though, but you know.
Yeah, I think it's a great question though, because that
question.
too is where you're going to see communities in isolation, right? So that's something I think, especially, you know, I'm a huge advocate for not just focusing on the dead people, getting and gleaning the stories from the living folks. And if you have family members that were stationed abroad, like, you know, even if they don't remember every base, get as many as you can, because whoever you leave your project to, or whoever becomes curious, they're going to question whether or not those folks are their people when the census, you know, becomes available, and they're not going to know if it is or it isn't, because no one documented and no one's around to answer those questions.
Right.
That's
So
why you got to order those files and get them
and
214s, because
Yeah.
it's sitting lined up right there where I've been.
And Nika,
yeah,
before I
what
get-
she's referring to is DD-214s, which are discharge paperwork, and that will list out who the soldier was, when they were, you know, inducted in, when they were discharged, where they served, any medals that they got while they were in service, any commendations, you know, if they were court-martialed, if they went to the jail, all that stuff is going to be in there. And typically you can't necessarily get those unless you're family or next of kin, or you have some sort of a tie to the soldier. So, you know, and some people have theirs already, but you got to remember a certain number of records were destroyed at the National Personnel Record Center. So the only way you know if you're usually it's alphabetical. You can tell, you know, if it's this letter, you know, they're pretty much sure that there's nothing that exists. But the time period we're talking about, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is going to be electronic. So let's hope that there's backup systems and ways to read the content later.
And check the courthouses, because I know before I shortly after I retired, you know, you can go to the courthouse and register it there. So, you know, it's accessible. So, you know, if you lose it or whatnot, you know.
And let us not forget some of the other isolated populations that some of us may have would be, let's say, the expatriates who went to Liberia, Sierra Leone, Trinidad,
that type,
the Bahamas, even those of us who have ancestors who went to Nova Scotia and other parts of Canada, whether it's Upper Canada West or Quebec, you know. So and there are records there that we could find.
Reminds me of the Rihanna and Fenty, about how her relatives are in the Bahamas, but they're Irish there. And that wasn't it like a small isolated family group of hers that was over there? I found that interesting. I'll have to find a link somewhere. And then I felt bad because there was a young lady, she's a half Irish and Black, and she just committed suicide. I think it was in Tipperary, or I can't pronounce it, in Ireland. And I saw the youth on Twitter discussing how they're isolated and what ways they can do to prevent this, you know, moving forward, about how they need resources to, you know, help their youth over there, that they're in these little Irish towns that are rural areas and they're isolated. So those are two like things that pop up in my mind right now, as far as overseas that I've seen recently. When it comes to isolation.
Well, I think you're right, though, because it's interesting that you made that comment, because at this wedding that I was at over the weekend, the officiant was American, but he lived in Ireland as a part of his job. And they're American Black people, like us, okay? And so over there, he said, and I said, I already know what the perception of you is over there. Everyone thinks that you're from West Africa, right? And he said, that is the number one thing that I deal with over here, is that everyone assumes that I'm Nigerian. And I said, well, you probably are, but of course you're, your first nationality for the most part is American. But it brings up an important point, because we have so many people, so many diverse people living around the world, especially like this young lady you talked about who is biracial. And so they're looking for identity. They're looking for something to connect with. So the more we share about these stories, the more we impart to young people, the more we post online, the more we share our findings, the more we become involved in having the dialogue, we are giving them a pathway out of feeling like they are the only person that has this I was going to say monkey on their back, or this experience, right, of having to maybe navigate two different worlds. So, as always, we're going to continue to tell you until we're blue in the face. Share the stories, impart the stories, put them out there. And, more than just that, right? We've given you 1,000 tools on how you can do that. It doesn't just have to be a book. It doesn't have to be written. There's a number of ways that you can do this. And I think us kind of covering this in a show is one means of doing that. Anything else before we get to viewer comments, you all? Tony?
I would just add that the Freedmen's Bureau located sometimes many families and took them to other places where there was work, if they were coming from somewhere where there were limited paid labor opportunities. I've seen, people taken to North Carolina, people taken to Tennessee, some halfway across the country for work.
And
And
Anything
I think
else
about the bad people. I don't know if they're bad people, but like, the lady that might have gave you an abortion back behind the woods, or the person that had all the herbs, like the voodoo man back in the, it's always that one, out of society person, but, they hang amongst themselves, and those type of people that, we might call shady, or, I think about those type of I don't want to say communities, but you have that type where you always know who's to go to the liquor man or the candy store lady, all them type of people. But I would say those are little isolated incidents of folks.
Yeah, I think that's true, right? The folks are dealing with the underworld. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
those people. You found
Everybody
the right
wasn't built
word.
for it. Yeah, everybody wasn't built for that kind of living. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Yeah.
so there are aspects of that too. It's interesting. Angela says that there are many documenting their lives on YouTube, some major lifestyle vloggers. Some are sharing a new biracial lifestyle sort of experience, like what it is to navigate those worlds. So I just definitely think we just have to keep that at the forefront, considering, the demographics of our youngest generations of people, and the fact that, that there's no monolithic experience. And, a friend of mine that
We had to learn the hard way.
yeah, I was about to say, I've got one friend on the panel who's biracial, and another friend of mine who's biracial told me that she's like, mixed kids are messed up. That's what she told me.
I think I came out pretty good, but yeah.
Well, she said, unless you have someone in your life that kind of helps guide you when you get to that identity phase, but not every kid has that.
No, they don't. And you still struggle.
And it makes me wonder, like, there's this movie on Netflix called America's Son, or American Son, with Kerry Washington. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because she's had a child and is married and estranged from this guy who's white. And some of the conversations they're having as a result of one of the major parts of the movie, they should have been having when the son was like 5. But it was kind of spoke to how people just aren't talking, right? And like walking these things out. It's like, your love can solve a number of things, but it might not solve identities for issues for your children. So, just as you might not be able to handle her hair because it curls a little bit tighter, you got to take her to the black salon. You might need to have some conversations with her or him about identity and what that looks like. And that may not be easy, because your preconceived notions might kind of drive stuff too. So anywho, all right, moving forward to our viewer comments, because of course you guys love to comment on BlackProGen Live. Janice Lovelace says, my mom grew up in Colorado. Her graduating class had 4 Black folks. They had a separate graduation from the white kids at the school. Look, can we talk about how trifling that is?
and still
Yo,
be going on. I
okay.
haven't
How
seen none
you
in the
gonna
last
have
couple years, but man,
so my whole thing is, do you know the resources that you had to expend to have that separate graduation for those 4 children? Oh
Right.
my
girl,
gosh. Oh Lord. On the census, many pages to find another B, meaning another person that has a racial designation of Black. They lived there because of work for grandfather. Sharon Bruno says there were several Black cowboys who lived in isolation while ranching in Texas and throughout the West. And Denise Muhammad mentions that her husband's ancestor moved from Alabama to Salt Lake City, Utah in the late 1800s, and that she later found out that he was a musician and relocated with his family because of his job. Right? There's a whole set of folks who are from Salt Lake City that are Black. And I think that's the one thing I think that's so funny is whenever we fly there, black folks just look for other Black people in Salt Lake.
we sure do. We spot ourselves too.
I know.
But it reminds me of Miss Biddy and all that. And then the second layer of it is when like Quincy Jones and all Mr. Ray and all them were out there on that music scene.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember his name
Yeah,
offhand, but Jimi Hendrix. There was like, I didn't know Seattle was popping off like that back then. And, even
y'all
when I
remind me
lived
of
here,
when I
it
went to
was,
college in Maine.
Oh,
There
Lord.
were 4 of us in my graduating class in
wow.
college. This tells you how it's changed. 1 was from Kenya and 3 of us were from Massachusetts. For real,
Wow.
for real. It's changed
Wow.
now.
Dante.
Okay.
Well, and you know what?
Three of
Technically-
us were from, and out of the 3, 2 were from Springfield.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the thing,
On the
though.
other side, Teresa's over
This
here.
also brings up another point, especially when you talk about predominantly white institutions and small pockets of Black kids going to these predominantly white schools. Those are communities within themselves. Because I went to a school that was, I was one of the only Black women, and I was one of the only Black folks that did not play sports. Let's talk about how that is another set of a community.
I was so isolated in college as well. It was just so.
I just need you to go on somewhere and sit down.
I know with
The
your vice and
HBCU.
self. Why you had to
so-
bring that up?
Thrown in our faces.
Okay, nobody told
It's
you
the
that. We don't care
HBCU.
about your. Okay, no, don't nobody care about no.
Anyways,
stinky hell you
Bowdoin just celebrated its 50th anniversary of the Afro Am. Couldn't make it up to Bowdoin, made it to New York City. And hey, first Black grad at Bowdoin was John B. Russworm.
Oh, see, we went looking for the Black grads, and there was this man named James. Was it Walter Hightower Jr.?
Woo, woo.
And we made the assumption that Walter was Black.
We will do that.
Because of James.
We made the
Ooh-wee.
assumption that Walter was Black because we were going through successive yearbooks trying to find like the first graduate, right? Because we wanted to invite them back, and we could have sworn Walter isn't that horrible? We swore
know.
Walter Hightower Jr. was Black, and so we had compiled our little list. And there's this little Dorothy Scholar, God rest her soul. That lady worked that school for 300 years. I promise. She was there with the Tyrannosaurus Rex, and we had our list compiled of Black alumni, right? Because some of the people, they didn't have pictures in the yearbook, but they just had names. But for some reason, we couldn't let go of Walter Hightower. We handed Miss Dorothy, and Miss Dorothy's like 4'10", 4'11". She's this little lady. So we handed her the list, and she said, "Why do you guys have Walter Hightower Jr. on this list?" And we were all kind of like, "Why should we?" And she said, "He's not Black." I said, "Poor man. People have been probably assuming this for his whole life. Poor thing. But hey, that's what you get for assuming, right? Make an ass out of you and me. Boy. All right. Well, moving forward, we've got to ask Mariah. We're waiting for our guest to join us. He will be here with us live tonight. Gonna make sure I check my messages. Hopefully, we have not been receiving crazy stuff. True. Of him trying to get in and he can't get
Lord,
in.
I ain't been checking my
No, I've been looking.
Okay.
I've been looking,
Okay.
so it's fine.
I
It's
just
fine.
dropped a link in the public chat about researching Black Mormons since we were talking about Salt Lake City. I forgot to posted that link earlier,
Mhm.
so you guys
That's a
can
Okay.
good
check that out.
article.
Yes, thank you, James, for sharing
Yeah,
that. All right,
thanks.
well, here is your favorite part of the show, Ask Mariah, where you, the viewer, submit your questions, queries, conundrums, and more. And for research help, specifically geared towards you from the panel. Of course, the panel never sees the queries beforehand. So that means that, this is all fresh and live and on the fly. We have not planned any of the answers that we're planning on giving. And so typically what happens with this is we weigh in. Sometimes the people that do the submissions join us in the chat room, or sometimes they join us via video. So we are expecting to get our visitor for tonight's iteration of BlackProGen Ask Mariah in a second, Mr. Demetrius Hunter. So hopefully he will join us, but I will read his query until he arrives. So then that way, when he magically appears, he'll be, here with us. All right. So the question was my Turner family connected to the same plantation as Nat Turner was on in Virginia? Okay. So he wants to know if his Turner family was connected to Nat Turner's family in Virginia. His ancestors, Clara and Ambert Turner, resided on the Samuel Turner plantation in Johnston County, North Carolina. The story has it the family came out of Southampton, Virginia. I can't find any documentation. Hi, Demetrius.
Hi.
All right, so he has joined us. So let me finish reading his query. And so the story has that they came out of Southampton, Virginia. He can't find any documentation. However, he has DNA matches that show up in the area. If he can locate Samuel Turner family prior to settling in North Carolina, he'll have an answer. And so what he's done, he has the enslavers list of enslaved with his great-great-grandmother and family on there. Amaretto or Ambert Turner, later listed on the census with her husband, Hardy Sanders, whose parents are Alan and Penny, and has done several DNA tests. So we're trying to see if our Turners are in fact connected with Nat Turner's Turners. All right. So thanks for joining us, Demetrius, and not being scared. We don't have the heebie-jeebies, and we don't give you the flu. Join us live.
Yes, that's right. How's everybody?
Magnificent.
Good. We're doing good. We're doing good.
Yes.
So have you gotten oral history that your folks are connected to the Turners? Is this one of the long-standing family myths that you're trying to solve?
That
here?
is one, yes. And with the DNA, I've been researching and trying to, put the two together. And
Okay.
still have difficulty in that because the Turners on my side moved to Johnston County back in the early 1800s.
Okay. Okay. So the first question I'm sure everyone on the panel is going to ask you is, where's your timeline?
Yes, indeed. So according to documents, Samuel Turner, which was the plantation owner, moved at least by 1830 to Johnston County, North Carolina. And I don't know anything prior to that. So that's my cutoff as far as
That's your cutoff.
prior to that.
Okay. And how did you get to that information? What were the steps that you took to get there?
Well, the census record showed Samuel was in Johnston County around 1830. And then there was a tax list in 1863 that shows, which is in Gully's district of Clayton, Johnston County, North Carolina. It shows my great-great-grandmother, who was named Amaretto. They shortened it for Amber, but she's there, and her mother Clara, which I confirmed through her death certificate that her mother name was Clara, is they're on the plantation with probably about 20 other enslaved people, which may have been her family. And this is the tax list that shows the enslaved. So that's what I have, pretty much.
Okay. Questions? James, you're leaning forward.
Well, the thing I was trying to look up is to figure out what could it be a connection between Nat Turner's owner and the Samuel Turner, which Demetrius is referring to. And so I was just doing a quick Google search, and I realized that Nat Turner's owner's name was Samuel Turner.
Right.
So, but I'm pretty sure it's a different person, because we kind of all probably know what happened to the to Nat Turner's own
Right.
Sam.
Yes.
I think we all kind of know what happened to him. So
Yes,
so it'd be two different people.
Yeah.
Now, with that being said, my biggest thing would be trying to investigate the connections between these two different Samuel Turners. I think that it's very, without having done any deep research into that family's history, I think it's interesting. You have two people named Samuel Turner, living in the same general area. So I'm wondering if perhaps maybe they shared some grandparents, maybe, or something of that nature. Because you have a genetic timing. Turner is a pretty common last name, but you're in the same general vicinity. So I it would not surprise me at all, based upon what you've shown and what you said, if you do have some kind of connection to him. But I think that the bridge to try to make that connection is going to be really researching the white Turners first, to try to get to a better understanding, perhaps, of your particular line.
Yes, I agree. That's what I've been doing, but the only thing I can't connect is the migration from Southampton, Virginia to North Carolina. And if I can find that connection, I think that would show me that there may be a possibility. But I don't know who Samuel Turner's father is. I think that's where I'm stuck at.
Okay.
So I would also chime in here. Like he said, maybe if it's like two timelines, right? Like you need distinguishing things between these two Samuel Turners, right? Like we already have, like, we know hard and fast death date for this, for Nat's person. But for your person, it carries on. And, several people in the chat room are saying, well, maybe these are first cousins, right? Because, folks like to pass names down, or they could be distant family members. I think this might require, some local research, right? Because if your folks, came from Southampton, you kind of want to vet all the Turners there. And then as we're talking about families in isolation, right? If Shelley was on the panel, she would say, go for the land, the water, right? Like what's the history of Johnston County or Johnson County, so you can see when they would have approximately migrated there, right? Ways that you can do that are looking at maybe land patents, deed records, right? Because really all you're doing is you've confirmed for the most part that your family were enslaved by these folks, but you're trying to establish a timeline for the slaveholder so that you know where your folks were at a particular point in time. So that does mean maybe looking at the earliest deed transactions, property transactions that you find this particular Samuel Turner in Johnson County. And then when that kind of like stops, then that might be a point where you then pick up and go to Southampton and see if, there's documents that then fill in the gaps, before the records start. And it may even also be court records too. Folks back then, especially if slaves were involved, they were suing somebody because it was profit, it was profit. So I'd look at that. I'd even look at marriages, right? That might have been a motivation to move there. Maybe his wife's family was from that area, or she inherited land there. Folks get blindsided and always focus on the men. Y'all know these women, they were doing the most when it came to slaves. So you've got to track their families too. And I think I just said to somebody a week ago, when you're looking at one woman, there are 3 different last names associated with just one married woman, because she's got her maiden name, she's got her married name, and then if she has a daughter, her daughter gets married, that's a separate surname. That's 3 with just between 2 women, right? So, and then let's not even count if the women get married more than once. So
her maternal line.
Exactly, right? So, it can go up or down, right? Either way, you've got 3 surnames for a woman. So one of the things I think that's helped me a lot is to kind of reconstruct the slave owning families in that particular region, like where my family lived. Like who were the plantations that were around them? Because those folks intermarried and they often migrated with each other. So that might also give you a clue as into, well, wait a minute, these Witherspoons are right next to my folks. And, they have a family history, or someone who's out there who's published published stuff that says that they migrated during this time. Well, let me see if my Turners or my Turner enslaving, folks did the same thing, the same thing at the same time. Or are the Turners and the Witherspoons intermarried? Did they buy and sell property from each other? Can you find transactions linking the two? All of this is, as much as we joke about endogamy, the enslavers community was highly endogamous and highly predictable.
Oh,
I was going to add that we have to keep in mind that Southampton is only 20 miles from North Carolina, and Nat Turner killed the Travis family. He didn't kill Samuel Turner. So it could be one and the same, just so you know. But there should be a lot of records on whoever that Samuel Turner is.
interesting.
So just because it's not that far, the 20 miles isn't that far. So there should be a lot of records.
Yeah, and in the chat room, there are several folks. One of the panelists, Shelley, says you have to go to Southampton and speak to the family folks. Their Turners are well researched.
Yeah.
Several folks are saying that Sharon Bruno says that that you can inbox her through the OGS Houston Facebook page, because someone, I guess, spoke to their group. She says, I'm a member of our OGS Houston, has done extensive research on the area, and she's a descendant of Nat Turner, and she's very
Houston?
involved in maintaining the history. Yeah. So
How do
yeah,
you spell that?
AAHGS.
Oh,
Houston.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah. And Shelley is saying timeline is critical, as we've stated before, along with other documents. And Renata is saying that it's more than 20 miles to Johnston County, though, Southampton, Virginia is.
Oh yeah, it's about 2.5, 3 hours to Johnston County.
Okay. And larger slaveholders, this is a good point. 84.3 Golden News, definitely this is right. Well-established slaveholders have more than one plantation. So you want to find out where the network is. And, if they moved and shifted folks from one place to another, may be the reason why, right? They had this land, that they just recently inherited from another family member. It may be a reason why they shifted folks down south. Because especially depending on when the time period is, right? People weren't, if you lived in Virginia, why in the world would you go to North Carolina when the land is open up in Mississippi and Louisiana and it's fertile and it hasn't been overworked?
Right.
Like, it makes no sense for that. You know what I mean? There's got to be a good reason. And if it's early, it makes sense, right? If it's before the second, the first real migration of African Americans from the upper South to the lower South, then it makes sense. But if it's during that time period, them folks weren't trying to not where they're getting all that good bayou land, and it's it's growing all kinds of stuff quickly and easily. Any other suggestions, you guys? Let's see.
Shelley actually took it out of my mouth regarding the Turner family having some research out there. I believe that when they got his skull, they were supposed to be doing some kind of DNA project or something on him, and so I don't know any details about it, but you may want to look that up. As a side note. And I know some of the older folks might not know who this is, but Nika, Orlando Anderson, with the guy who allegedly killed Tupac Shakur. He actually was a descendant of Nat Turner, believe it or not.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there's actually,
wasn't he also a member of the Crips of the Bloods?
The Crips, yeah.
Yes.
So that's just a side note.
If we're gonna throw out random facts, you got to throw that out too.
But yeah. But just I always thought that was kind of ironic. Like the guy who allegedly killed like this black radical rapper Tupac was descended from Nat Turner. Like I always thought that was kind of ironic. Yeah.
Well, there's
Killmonger.
exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
Let's see. Shelley says, look at Renata. I have sent Demetrius the info on Bruce Turner, who's the third great grandson, I believe, of Nat Turner. I think she's got contact information, so you can connect with them.
Thank you, Renata. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Anything else you guys can think of? Well, first of all, thanks for even knowing that there are tax records associated with this and that you went to go find them.
Yeah.
It's true, because people think there's a slave census and I can just put the name in and search and it's going to be right there, right? We all know that that's not the case. So thanks for doing your due diligence.
Sure.
On that aspect. It's just really tight. I think the biggest thing is tightening up your timelines and being able to have delineating factors. Maybe one Samuel L. Turner and the other one Samuel H. Turner, and you'd only find that through looking through some of these property records and court records, so that you can separate, or maybe they're one and the same people.
He's actually Samuel S. Turner, so that'll help tremendously.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Renata says you're welcome. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you've got a great journey. Of course, now we're all invested, so you have to tell us what happens.
Okay, will do.
some-
I'll check out Og's Houston and
Yes.
then the information Renata sent me, and hopefully that'll help. And then I'll do my more diligent due diligence going to Southampton. Yes.
All right. All right.
This
Well,
is the
feel
National
free.
Geographic that did the DNA test
Okay.
on the Turner remains. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Good
That's
to
good to know.
Thank you.
Thank you for checking that out for us, Ellen. Demetrius, feel free to stay on, or you can head on out. We're gonna do
All
our
right.
little closing here. Thanks for joining us. And like I said,
Certainly.
keep us posted on what you find.
Will do. Thank you for having me.
Thank
All
you.
right. Awesome.
Have a good one.
You too.
Yeah,
Thank
take
You
care.
too.
All right.
All right. So do you need help with the brick wall? I would hope you do, because most people do. I don't know a single person that hasn't needed help with their genealogy research at any point in time. So feel free to reach out to BlackProGen Live with your query today. A link to submit is in the description of each and every episode of the show. Remember to be super specific and do your due diligence, just like Demetrius did, where he combed through all the documents and brought them with him so he could reference those things. If you've got oral history, if you've DNA tested, and the more you tell us, the better. The more you tell us, go ad nauseum, go overboard. That's better than not, right? Because otherwise you're going to have Shelly and other people fussing at you because we were trying to get answers, and you don't want us finger wagging. So you just may be selected for to be featured on one of our upcoming episodes of BlackProGen Live. All right, what are we doing next week, you guys? It is the season 5 finale of BlackProGen Live. We will be celebrating 100 episodes of this crazy stinking show that you stop your Tuesday nights to watch, right? You could be watching Kate and Randall and Kevin and their parents on This Is Us. You could be watching a number of other shows, but you decide you want to peruse genealogy on Tuesday nights, and we love the fact that you join us. And so we will be celebrating the 100th time we have sat down at these computers and did this just for you. Next week in the special, we'll go behind the scenes on all things BlackProGen Live, from the origins of the panelists. That you guys are not ready for the origins of the panelists. I know you guys are not, because I think you guys think you have everybody pegged on what they do, and you don't know. You don't have any idea about this group. You have no clue. I'm just letting you know that ahead of time. And so we'll be talking about our origin stories, how we get the show to you, our thoughts on the journey we've taken over the last 5 years. We'll have some special guest viewers, of course, and we're going to be giving away prizes for those of you that submitted your praise reports for how BlackProGen Live has been important and significant for you in your genealogy research. So please be sure, do not miss next week, you guys. We'll actually have everyone on the panel will be on for the show, and we have never done that. You know what, panel? Do we want to wear something festive for this?
I was going to anyway.
Look, you know me, I'll come busting in like I'm at the clubs in the 90s. And you know what I'm saying? Like I'm up in Starlight somewhere at Fort Hood, Texas. Nah.
You know what now?
Yeah, I'm gonna be happy.
Starlights.
Yeah, it was
Oh,
a club
my
we used to
goodness.
go to back in the day. Was
No, she said
I
it
was
was
at Fort. It was
it
called
was a club
Starlight.
we used to go to.
Starlight.
Yeah.
True. I need the video of you busting the cardboard out and breakdancing. I know it's out there somewhere.
Wait a minute.
I didn't go that far. I was kind of, the
You-
LLL Cool J all around girl. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
I was
Okay.
more that.
I like
I
how
wasn't
she
that
moved her
tomboyish,
shoulders.
but yeah.
Move their shoulders.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I just can't wait though. I'm so excited. Like I'm just like, y'all grab your people that ain't watched the show, get on your IG, your Twitter, come on out and have a good time with us. We just gonna be off the chain.
Have we decided if we're dressing up or not? Like what are we wearing? You guys, we need an
BlackProGen
outfit.
merch. BlackProGen
We can wear our
merch.
BlackProGen
Yeah.
merch, right? Because Tony has got that readily available in Charleston.
Okay,
So
we'll do it.
so she can wear her BlackProGen Live merch. We highly encourage everyone else to wear their BlackProGen Live merch if you have it for the show. yeah, it's gonna be a good one, you guys. I mean, we really need to just take a step back and kind of celebrate this machine. If you all tuned in to the Virtual Genealogical Society, they had their conference last wait 2
Ooh, that
weeks
was
ago.
good.
I
Ooh,
love that, Shelley. Look what she
What did she say? Shelly says
what
hello
was in the street at 16.
in the street at 16. Take it from there, my lord. Shelly also says if you don't want to wear your BlackProGen merch, you can wear your "We Were Never the Problem" t-shirts, any statement shirts
yeah,
you guys
I still
want,
got
right?
that.
So I was wearing mine yesterday, so yeah, I'd have to get a quick wash before next week. But yeah, you guys just make this a festive environment. I will, you know what? I will have my glass of wine to toast this because me and True is tired. And we will have our libations. We can't say what's going to happen for everybody else. So if you don't want to have you drink a wine, you don't have to. But I think Tony might join us, and maybe Angela might join us, and maybe Bernice might join us. Yes. And this is a celebration. So even if you got to go get your cooked champagne, whatever it is,
Your sparkling
feel
water,
free.
just bring it.
we are having a virtual party next week. So
Celebration.
A celebrate.
Celebration.
It's a celebrate.
It's a celebrate.
Us just having to celebrate. All right.
Yeah.
So True, what are your signing out moments here? What would you like to say to our viewers, who have stayed along with us for this evening?
I know. I'm just so glad they hung out and they've made it too. We made it. But y'all have made it with us as well. So this is all about y'all, as is just as much as it is important to us. To Mr. Hunter, we thank you. You did awesome. I'm so glad to see Tony because I know she's busy down there, but she still takes time out. Ellen and Teresa, Puddin's third cousins, and my baby James. And we just appreciate you all out there. And like I said, go all over. If you're on Facebook, tag your friends and just tell them to come and hang out with us. We really are going to have a good time and celebrate BlackProGen and you, because you are the genealogy in our seasoning as well. So I'm so excited, and we'll see you soon. Good night.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen.
Hello, everybody out there.
BlackProGen Live.
BlackProGen Live.
The unapologetic Black and people of color viewpoint.
It's a place where evidence tells the stories.